Let the tension dissolve from your shoulders. Feel the weight of your body sinking deeper into comfort. Your breathing slows, becomes natural, effortless. The noise of today fades into whisper, into silence, into nothing. You're safe here in this quiet space between waking and dreaming. Tonight, we're going on a different kind of journey. Not forward into tomorrow's worries, but backward into yesterday's mysteries. Far backward, beyond history, beyond memory, into the deep wells of time where our story truly begins. Close your eyes and let yourself drift toward the fire at the mouth of a cave 300,000 years ago, where everything that makes you human was born. The sun rises over a landscape you wouldn't recognize as Earth. This is Africa, but not the Africa of deserts and safari tours. The Sahara doesn't yet exist as the forbidding barrier we know today. Where sand will one day stretch for thousands of miles, grasslands roll green and endless, punctuated by lakes that shimmer under cloudless skies. Rivers carve their paths through valleys where animals gather in numbers that would stagger the imagination. This is a world in flux, caught between ice ages, breathing in the warm intervals when life explodes across the continents. Somewhere in this verdant world, in the region we now call Morocco, near a place called Jebel Irhoud, a group gathers at the entrance to a cave. They are us and they are not us. If you saw one walking down a modern street, you might look twice. The face would seem familiar, almost contemporary. High cheekbones, a nose bridge you'd recognize, teeth that could belong to anyone you know. But the skull is different, elongated, stretched backward in a way that speaks of a brain still finding its final shape. This is Homo sapiens at the very moment of becoming, caught in the act of transformation from something ancient into something new. These people didn't appear suddenly, like actors stepping onto an empty stage. They emerged gradually from populations that had been evolving across Africa for hundreds of thousands of years. Their ancestors include Homo heidelbergensis, whose fossils scatter across the continent, and others whose names we don't yet know, whose bones may still lie waiting in caves and sediments we haven't explored. The story of human origins isn't a simple tree with clear branches. It's a tangled bush, populations mixing and separating, genes flowing between groups across vast distances and time spans that dwarf our comprehension. What we know now, through the patient work of archaeologists who've sifted through ancient soils and dated stone tools with atomic precision, is that by 300,000 years ago, something remarkable had happened. The face of humanity had modernized. The people living at Jebel Irhoud and other sites across Africa looked from the front like us. Their brains were already large, averaging around 1,300 cubic centimeters, roughly the same size as yours. But the brain shape was still evolving, still reorganizing itself inside that elongated skull. The frontal lobes, where planning and abstract thinking happen, were not yet fully developed. The parietal regions, involved in sensory integration and spatial reasoning, would continue to round out over the next 100,000 years. These early humans left evidence of their existence in layers of stone and earth. At a site in Kenya called Olorgesailie, dating to roughly the same era, archaeologists found something extraordinary: evidence of long-distance trade. Obsidian, that black volcanic glass prized for its sharp edges, had been carried from sources more than 50 miles away. Someone had transported these stones across the landscape, through territories and past groups of other people. This wasn't just survival. This was exchange, planning, social connection across distances. The tools themselves had evolved. The simple hand axes that had served humanity's ancestors for more than 1,000,000 years were giving way to more sophisticated implements. These people were making projectile points, sharp tips designed to be hafted onto spears and thrown at prey from a distance. The appearance of these projectiles marks a revolution in human capability. Hunting becomes safer when you can kill from afar. You can target larger, more dangerous animals without risking close combat. The megafauna of the Pleistocene, those massive beasts that roamed every continent, became accessible prey in ways they hadn't been before. Even more intriguingly, these sites contain pigments, pieces of red and yellow ochre, minerals rich in iron oxide, worn smooth from grinding. The people at Sali were processing these materials 320,000 years ago. Ochre doesn't help you kill an animal or crack open a nut. Its value is symbolic. You can paint with it, mark your body, transform your appearance. The presence of ochre suggests minds that could think beyond the immediate, that could imagine representation, that could create meaning from color. The climate during this period was capricious, swinging between wet and dry phases driven by cycles in Earth's orbit. These swings, happening roughly every 20,000 years, would have had profound effects on where people could live and how they survived. During wet phases, the African interior bloomed. Lakes filled, grasslands expanded, and the corridors between Africa and the rest of the world opened. The Sinai Peninsula and the Arabian Peninsula, today's harsh desert crossings, became green pathways where humans and animals could travel freely. During dry phases, populations contracted, pushed into refugia near reliable water sources, forced to innovate or perish. This environmental instability may have been the crucible that forged human adaptability. When your world changes every few generations, when the landscapes your grandparents knew become unrecognizable, you must be flexible. You must be able to learn new skills, adopt new strategies, imagine different futures. The archaeological record suggests that by 300,000 years ago, humans were already showing this flexibility. They lived in diverse environments, from the Mediterranean coasts to the grasslands of East Africa to the woodlands of the South. Each region demanded different knowledge, different tools, different approaches to survival. Consider what life was like for these early humans. They lived in small groups, probably no more than 20 or 30 people, bound together by kinship and cooperation. Everyone knew everyone else intimately. Your survival depended on the group's cohesion, on maintaining relationships, on sharing knowledge and resources. Children grew up learning from their parents and elders, watching how to knap stone, where to find water in the dry season, which plants were edible and which would kill you. The day began with the sun. Light meant safety, time to move, to hunt, to gather. They ranged across landscapes we can barely reconstruct, following game trails, reading signs in the earth that are invisible to modern eyes. A broken twig, a distant dust cloud, the alarm call of a bird. Every sound, every scent carried information crucial to survival. Their senses were sharper than ours, their awareness more acute. They had to be. The world was full of predators who saw humans as prey, of competitors who wanted the same resources, of dangers that could end your life in an instant if you weren't paying attention. Yet amidst this constant vigilance, there was also wonder. Imagine the first person who ground ochre and mixed it with fat or water and drew a line on a rock face on their own skin. That moment when they stepped back and saw their mark, saw that they could leave evidence of their existence, that they could make the world respond to their imagination. That was a revolution as profound as any technological innovation, because it marked the emergence of symbolic thought, the ability to let one thing stand for another, to create meaning from material. The population of early Homo sapiens was small, perhaps only a few thousand breeding individuals across all of Africa. Genetic evidence suggests a bottleneck around this time, a period when the human population dwindled to dangerously low numbers. We came close to extinction before our story really began. But those who survived carried within them the genetic toolkit for everything that would follow: language, art, science, civilization. They didn't know they were the ancestors of billions. They were simply trying to survive another day, to see another sunrise, to ensure their children lived long enough to have children of their own. And yet, in their DNA and in the tools they left behind, we can see the beginnings of modernity. Not fully formed, not complete, but emerging. Like a photograph developing slowly in chemical solution, the image of humanity was becoming visible. The face was there. The large brain was there. The capacity for symbolic thought was there. Over the next 100,000 years, these elements would crystallize, sharpen, become the foundation for everything that makes us uniquely human. Imagine you're holding a piece of flint in your left hand. It's roughly the size of your palm, gray-black, with a surface that catches the light like glass. In your right hand, you grip a hammerstone, a river cobble chosen for its density and shape. You've watched your father do this 1,000 times. You've felt the stones yourself since you could walk. But making a tool, a real tool that will cut meat and hide, that will last, that takes knowledge accumulated over countless generations. The hammerstone comes down at precisely the right angle. Too steep and the flake won't attach. Too shallow and it skitters off uselessly. The impact sends a shock wave through the flint, traveling faster than sound through the stone's crystalline structure. A flake pops off, spiraling through the air to land at your feet. Its edge, where it's separated from the core, is sharper than any modern razor blade. A line of molecules thick that can slice through hide with barely any pressure. This is lithic technology, and it's been at the heart of human survival for more than 2 million years. But by 300,000 years ago, it had evolved into something sophisticated. The people of the Middle Paleolithic weren't just hitting rocks together randomly. They were executing complex reduction sequences, transforming a raw nodule of stone into multiple specialized tools through a series of carefully planned strikes. They could look at a piece of raw material and see the finished tools hidden inside it, waiting to be released. This kind of planning, this ability to hold a sequence of actions in your mind and execute them in order, requires cognitive sophistication we once believed was unique to fully modern humans. Different tools serve different purposes. Some flakes were left sharp and unmodified, used for quick cutting tasks and then discarded. Others were carefully retouched. Their edges worked with smaller strikes to create specific shapes. Scrapers for processing hides, removing fat and flesh from the inside of animal skins. Burins, specialized chisels for grooving bone and antler. Points that could be hafted onto spears with plant fiber or sinew and animal glue. Each tool represented hours of learning, practice, knowledge about stone properties and fracture mechanics that had to be passed down through generations. But stone tools, revolutionary as they were, could only take human survival so far. The real transformation came with fire. Control of fire was possibly the single most important technological achievement in human evolutionary history. It changed everything. What we could eat, where we could live, how we protected ourselves, even how our bodies and brains developed. The evidence for fire use goes back much farther than 300,000 years. At sites like Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, there's evidence of burned bone and plant material from 1 million years ago. But there's a crucial difference between using fire and making fire. Using fire means tending flames that began naturally from lightning strikes or volcanic activity, keeping them alive for as long as possible, carrying embers carefully from place to place. Making fire means creating it whenever you need it, commanding it, being its master rather than its dependent. Recent discoveries push the origin of fire-making back to at least 400,000 years ago. At a site called East Farm in England, archaeologists found fragments of iron pyrite alongside heat-damaged flint hand axes and reddened silk that had been baked by intense heat. The pyrite, rare in that area, had been brought there deliberately. When struck against flint, pyrite produces sparks hot enough to ignite tinder. This is fire-making, the deliberate creation of combustion, and it may have been practiced by the Neanderthals who inhabited Europe long before modern humans arrived there. By the time of our early Homo sapiens ancestors 300,000 years ago, fire had become central to human existence. Archaeological sites from this period show hearths, areas of concentrated burning, surrounded by tools and animal bones. These hearths were the centers of social life, the places where people gathered after the day's work, where they cooked food, where they stayed warm through cold nights, where children learned from elders and stories were told. Cooking food with fire may seem simple, but its implications were profound. Heat breaks down tough plant fibers, makes meat easier to chew and digest, kills parasites and bacteria that cause disease. Cooked food provides more calories with less effort. Over evolutionary time, this meant humans could have smaller, more efficient guts. The energy saved could be redirected to our brains, supporting those expensive, calorie-hungry neurons. Some scientists argue that cooking made possible the large-brained creatures we became. Fire also expanded the human ecological niche in revolutionary ways. With fire, humans could live in places that would otherwise be uninhabitable. Cold northern latitudes became accessible. You could survive freezing nights if you had fire to warm you. Predators who would otherwise make short work of relatively weak, defenseless humans learned to fear flames. Light extends the day, giving more time for tool-making, for socializing, for the transmission of knowledge. Around a fire, after dark, humans could create culture in ways impossible for species that must sleep when the sun sets. But fire was also a tool for modifying the environment on a grand scale. Evidence from various sites suggests that by the Middle Paleolithic, humans were using fire to manage landscapes. Controlled burns could clear underbrush, making travel easier and creating new growth that attracted game animals. Fire could drive animals toward kill sites, channeling them into narrow passages where hunters waited with spears. In Australia, indigenous peoples would later develop sophisticated firestick farming, using carefully controlled burns to maintain productive ecosystems. The roots of these practices may extend far back into the Paleolithic. Even more remarkable is evidence from around 300,000 years ago at Kizum Cave in Israel. Researchers analyzing flint tools from this site found that different types of tools had been heated to different specific temperatures. Flakes used for quick cutting were exposed to high heat. Blades, requiring more careful manufacture, were heated more gently. This suggests that the inhabitants of Kizum Cave weren't just using fire for warmth and cooking. They were using it to modify the properties of their stone tools, heat-treating flint to make it easier to work, to produce sharper, longer-lasting edges. This level of pyrotechnology requires deep understanding of both fire and stone, the ability to control temperature, to recognize how heat changes material properties. It's sophisticated engineering, practiced by people who lived hundreds of thousands of years before the first cities. With fire and stone, humans could kill large animals safely and efficiently. They could process hides into clothing and shelter. They could defend campsites against predators. They could colonize new environments. But technology alone wasn't enough. These early humans also needed social structures sophisticated enough to coordinate action, to transmit knowledge, to maintain relationships across time and space. They needed, in other words, to communicate with a complexity that approached language. Language doesn't fossilize. It leaves no bones, no tools, no clear markers in the archaeological record. We can't listen to recordings of how our ancestors spoke 300,000 years ago. Yet language must have existed in some form because everything else we see in the archaeological record requires it. Complex tool-making sequences need to be taught. Coordinated hunting strategies need to be planned. Social relationships need to be negotiated. All of this becomes vastly easier with language, with the ability to use arbitrary sounds to represent objects, actions, ideas. When did language emerge? The question has tantalized researchers for generations. Some argue for a recent origin, perhaps 50,000 or 60,000 years ago, coinciding with the appearance of clearly symbolic art in Europe. Others point to earlier evidence, suggesting that language evolved gradually over hundreds of thousands of years, perhaps beginning as simple communication systems and growing more complex as brain structures developed. The anatomy offers some clues. Humans have a descended larynx, a voice box positioned lower in the throat than in other primates. This creates a larger resonating chamber, allowing us to produce the varied vowel sounds necessary for spoken language. But it also creates a choking hazard. Unlike other mammals, we can't breathe and swallow simultaneously. This trade-off suggests strong selective pressure for speech. When did our ancestors develop a descended larynx? Fossil evidence is ambiguous, but some researchers argue it was present in Homo heidelbergensis, the species that gave rise to both modern humans and Neanderthals. More tellingly, we have the FOXP2 gene, sometimes called the language gene, though that's an oversimplification. This gene, involved in the development of brain circuits related to speech and language, differs from the version found in other primates. Modern humans and Neanderthals share the same version of FOXP2, suggesting it evolved in their common ancestor, perhaps 500,000 years ago. If Neanderthals had the genetic capacity for complex speech, it's reasonable to assume early Homo sapiens did as well. But having the anatomical and genetic capacity for language doesn't mean language existed in its modern form. Language development was probably gradual, building on simpler communication systems, adding complexity as cognitive abilities expanded and social needs grew. Early humans may have used proto-language, communication systems more limited than modern language but more sophisticated than animal calls. Evidence for symbolic thought, which many researchers see as necessary for complex language, appears by at least 100,000 years ago and possibly much earlier. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, archaeologists found pieces of ochre engraved with geometric patterns, abstract designs that serve no practical purpose. These engravings date to 75,000 years ago. Someone took the time to create these patterns, to impose order and meaning on a piece of stone. That requires symbolic thinking, the ability to let one thing represent another, to create and recognize meaning beyond immediate physical reality. Even more intriguing is recent work suggesting that cave art, which appears in abundance starting around 40,000 years ago, might be connected to language development. Researchers have noticed that cave paintings often cluster in areas with specific acoustic properties, places where sound reverberates strongly. These acoustic hot spots might have been chosen deliberately. The paintings could represent attempts to transfer information between sensory modalities, converting sounds into visual images. If you make certain sounds in these acoustic spaces and then try to represent those sounds visually, you're engaging in the kind of cross-modal thinking that underlies language, where abstract meanings can be expressed through different sensory channels. This theory remains speculative, but it aligns with evidence that early humans were paying attention to the relationship between sound and symbol. At various sites across Africa and Europe, archaeologists have found perforated shells, often colored with ochre, clearly meant to be worn as decoration. These shells appear starting around 100,000 years ago. Why wear shells? They make noise when you move, creating a rhythmic clicking. They draw attention, marking you as an individual. They can signify status, identity, group membership. They are, in other words, symbolic objects, extensions of self that communicate meaning to others. Music, too, may have deep roots. The oldest known musical instruments are bone flutes from European sites dating to 40,000 years ago. But the presence of perforated shells and the acoustic properties of decorated caves suggest that music, in simpler forms, may be much older. Rhythm, melody, harmony, these are linguistic in nature, patterns of sound that carry meaning and emotion. Singing may have preceded or developed alongside speech, a way of coordinating group activities, bonding individuals, creating shared emotional experiences. The significance of symbolic thought can't be overstated. It represents a cognitive threshold, a qualitative leap that separates human minds from those of our closest relatives. Chimpanzees are intelligent, capable of tool use, even simple cultural transmission. But they don't create art. They don't use arbitrary symbols to communicate complex ideas. They don't tell stories or speculate about what happens after death. These uniquely human capacities all depend on symbolic thinking, on the ability to mentally represent things that aren't immediately present, to imagine alternatives to reality, to plan for distant futures and learn from distant pasts. With language and symbolic thought, humans could do more than simply survive. They could create culture, bodies of knowledge and belief that transcended individual lifespans. An elder could teach a child not just by demonstration but by explanation, speeding up learning, passing on not just techniques but understanding. Groups could coordinate complex activities, planning multi-day hunts, organizing migrations, negotiating alliances with other groups. Individuals could express identity, creativity, imagination in ways that enriched social life and strengthened bonds between people. By 300,000 years ago, early Homo sapiens had brains large enough and structured appropriately to support complex language and symbolic thought. The archaeological record shows increasing evidence of behaviors requiring these capacities. Long-distance trade, specialized tool-making, use of pigments, possibly early burial practices. Over the next 100,000 years, these behaviors would intensify, elaborate, become the foundation for everything that followed. For most of human evolutionary history, our ancestors lived only in Africa. The continent was our cradle, the place where we evolved, where we developed the basic toolkit of physical and cognitive abilities that defines our species. But staying in Africa wasn't the plan, if we can even say there was a plan. Humans, like all successful species, had a tendency to expand, to colonize new territories, to push the boundaries of their range. And so, in waves spread across tens of thousands of years, humans began to leave Africa, carrying their genes and cultures into the wider world. The migration out of Africa wasn't a single event, a dramatic exodus like something from an ancient epic. It was messy, complicated, full of false starts and dead ends. Early attempts at leaving Africa may have begun as far back as 270,000 years ago. Evidence from sites like Mislia Cave in Israel suggests that early Homo sapiens reached the Levant, the bridge of land connecting Africa to Asia and Europe, by 185,000 years ago. But these early pioneers didn't establish lasting populations. They died out, retreated, or were absorbed into local populations of other human species. Their genetic legacy, if they left any, is minimal. The most significant dispersal occurred between 70,000 and 50,000 years ago, during a period when the climate had created favorable conditions for migration. This is sometimes called the Southern Route, because genetic and archaeological evidence suggests people followed the coastlines of the Arabian Peninsula and South Asia, eventually reaching Australia by around 60,000 years ago. Why the coast? Coastal environments are productive, rich in seafood, shellfish, seabirds, and their eggs. People with experience gathering shellfish along the African coast could apply that knowledge in new territories, finding familiar resources in unfamiliar places. Following the coast also meant never straying far from the sea, that reliable source of food and water. But getting out of Africa in the first place required favorable conditions. Today, the Sinai Peninsula and the Arabian Peninsula are harsh, arid deserts where survival would be nearly impossible for foot travelers without modern technology. But these regions haven't always been deserts. Research using climate models and geological evidence shows that the region went through wet phases driven by cyclic changes in Earth's orbit. During these phases, roughly every 20,000 years, northern summers became warmer. Increased solar radiation drove stronger monsoons, bringing rain to areas that are now bone dry. Lakes formed. Grasslands expanded. The Sahara became green. The Arabian Peninsula bloomed with vegetation. During these windows of opportunity, humans could walk out of Africa without crossing impossible barriers. Evidence from sites like Kalam Mission 4 in the Nefud Desert of Saudi Arabia shows that these favorable conditions occurred at least 5 times between 400,000 and 55,000 years ago. Stone tools found at the site suggest that not just modern humans but earlier human species also used these wet corridors to expand their ranges. The movements of humans and animals during these periods would have been bidirectional. People didn't just leave Africa. They also returned, bringing with them genes, tools, ideas from their travels. Once humans crossed into Asia, they encountered a world already inhabited by other members of the genus Homo. In Europe and Western Asia lived the Neanderthals, who had been there for hundreds of thousands of years, perfectly adapted to Ice Age conditions. In Eastern Asia lived other populations we know less about, including the mysterious Denisovans, known primarily from DNA recovered from a few bone fragments in a cave in Siberia. These weren't quite separate species in the strict biological sense. When modern humans met these groups, they interbred. Today, most non-Africans carry 2 to 3% Neanderthal DNA in their genomes, genetic echoes of those ancient encounters. The interbreeding between modern humans and Neanderthals is one of the most fascinating aspects of the migration story. When did it happen? Where? What were these meetings like? The genetic evidence suggests the main period of interbreeding occurred between 50,000 and 45,000 years ago, as modern humans spread into Europe and Asia. But there's also evidence of much earlier contact, perhaps as far back as 270,000 years ago, suggesting the relationship between these groups was long-standing and complex. Some of the Neanderthal genes we carry clearly provided advantages. Variants involved in immune response, in skin pigmentation adapted to northern climates, in metabolizing different types of food, these helped modern humans survive in new environments. Neanderthals had been living in Ice Age Europe for hundreds of thousands of years. They knew things modern humans didn't. Their genes carried adaptations modern humans lacked. By interbreeding, modern humans essentially downloaded that knowledge, acquiring through genetics what would have taken thousands of years to evolve independently. But despite this exchange, Neanderthals went extinct. By about 40,000 years ago, they had vanished from the archaeological record, leaving modern humans as the sole surviving species of the genus Homo in Eurasia. What? The question remains hotly debated. Was it climate change as ice sheets advanced and retreated, disrupting ecosystems? Was it competition with modern humans for resources, with our species having some slight edge that accumulate over thousands of years? Was it simply demographics, with Neanderthal populations already small and fragmented, vulnerable to random fluctuations in birth and death rates? Most likely, it was a combination of all these factors, different in different regions, accumulating over millennia until Neanderthal populations simply couldn't sustain themselves anymore. The migration of humans into Europe accelerated around 40,000 years ago. Archaeological sites from this period show a fluorescence of sophisticated tool-making, art, symbolic objects. This is the Upper Paleolithic Revolution, once thought to mark the first appearance of fully modern human behavior. We now know that many of these behaviors appeared earlier in Africa, but their expression in Europe was particularly intense, perhaps because the challenging environment demanded innovation, or because population densities were increasing, intensifying cultural transmission. By 35,000 years ago, modern humans had established themselves throughout Europe, adapting to the cold, learning to hunt the megafauna of the glacial plains, mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses, giant deer and cave bears. They built sophisticated shelters, created art on cave walls that still astounds us today, developed elaborate burial practices that hint at complex belief systems. They had become the dominant species, not through physical strength, they were weaker than Neanderthals, but through cognitive flexibility, through culture, through the ability to innovate and adapt faster than environmental changes could eliminate them. The final chapter of the Great Human Dispersal would take place later, as humans colonized the Americas, crossing from Asia into Alaska during the last ice age when sea levels were low enough to expose a land bridge across the Bering Strait. That happened around 15,000 years ago. By 10,000 years ago, humans had spread to every continent except Antarctica, had adapted to every environment from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforests, from mountain highlands to desert oases. We had become a truly global species, shaped by our origins in Africa but no longer confined by them. Imagine cold so intense it transforms the world. Glaciers, rivers of ice miles thick, creep down from the polar regions, grinding continents beneath their weight. Sea levels drop as water is locked in ice, exposing land bridges, connecting continents that had been separated for millions of years. The climate becomes arid. With so much water frozen, less evaporates, less falls as rain. Forests retreat. Grasslands, steppes, and tundra expand, supporting vast herds of herbivores adapted to the cold. Mammals with their dense fur and curved tusks, woolly rhinoceroses, giant ground sloths, herds of horses and bison numbering in the thousands. This was the world our ancestors inherited when they pushed out of Africa into Eurasia. The Pleistocene epoch, which lasted from about 2.6 million years ago to 11,700 years ago, was characterized by repeated cycles of glaciation and warmer intervals. During the coldest phases, glacial maximas, ice sheets covered much of northern Europe, Asia, and North America. Humans had to adapt or die. The fact that we're here, that our lineage survived, is testimony to extraordinary resilience and ingenuity. Surviving the Ice Age required solving multiple interconnected problems. How do you stay warm when temperatures regularly drop below freezing? How do you find food when plant resources are scarce and scattered? How do you protect yourself from predators, some of which, like cave lions and short-faced bears, were larger and more dangerous than any carnivores alive today? The solutions our ancestors devised weren't simple or singular. They were complex, integrating technology, social organization, and accumulated knowledge in ways that transformed human existence. Shelter was the first necessity. Contrary to popular imagination, Ice Age humans didn't spend most of their time in deep caves. Caves were sometimes used, especially in regions where they were available, but they weren't always comfortable or safe. Bears, other predators, often claimed the best caves. Moreover, the best places to hunt and gather weren't always near caves. Humans needed portable shelter, structures they could build from available materials and abandon when they moved. In the treeless steppes that covered much of Ice Age Eurasia, timber wasn't an option. Instead, humans built structures from the bones of mammoths. These enormous animals, which could weigh 6 tons and stood 11 feet tall at the shoulder, provided building material in abundance. Their bones were massive, durable, resistant to decay. At sites across Eastern Europe, archaeologists have found the remains of dwellings constructed from mammoth skulls, ribs, tusks, and leg bones arranged in circular patterns and probably covered with animal hides. Some of these structures used bones from dozens of individual animals, suggesting they were communal projects, maintained and expanded over generations. These bone huts weren't simple lean-tos. They were engineered structures, partially dug into the ground for stability and insulation. The floor would be excavated a foot or two deep, creating a depression that trapped warmer air. The mammoth bones formed a framework, and hides were draped over the top, held in place with stones and more bones. Inside, a central hearth provided heat and light. The hide covering could be weighted and sealed against the wind. These structures could keep the interior temperature significantly warmer than the outside, creating a microclimate where people could survive even when the wind chill outside would kill an exposed human in minutes. Clothing was equally crucial. Early hominins in warmer climates could survive with minimal covering, but in Ice Age conditions, the right clothing meant the difference between life and death. Around 50,000 years ago, something revolutionary happened. Humans invented the eyed needle. Before this, clothing was probably loose-fitting hides thrown over the shoulders, more like cloaks than tailored garments. The needle, carved from bone or ivory with a tiny eye drilled through one end, changed everything. With a needle and thread made from animal sinews, humans could sew fitted garments, jackets with sleeves, trousers, boots. They could create layers, using fur on the inside for warmth and leather on the outside for wind and water resistance. This might seem like a small technological advance, but it's hard to overstate its importance. Fitted, layered clothing allowed humans to maintain body heat far more efficiently, to remain active in conditions that would otherwise be debilitating. Evidence of this advanced clothing technology appears in the archaeological record through the proliferation of small, sharp stone blades, microliths, ideal for cutting and sewing leather and fur. Sites show bone needles, awls for punching holes, scrapers specially designed for working hides. The fact that these tools appear in abundance suggests that hide working and clothing production had become major activities, occupying significant time and skill. Food was the constant challenge. Ice Age environments, while harsh, were also productive in certain ways. The vast grasslands supported enormous herds of herbivores. A single mammoth could provide thousands of pounds of meat, enough to feed a group for weeks. But hunting these animals was dangerous and required sophisticated strategies. You couldn't simply run at a mammoth with a spear. These animals were intelligent, dangerous when threatened, capable of killing a human with a single swipe of their tusks. Successful hunting required cooperation, planning, and specialized tools. Groups of hunters would coordinate their actions, driving animals toward natural traps, cliffs, bogs, narrow valleys where escape was difficult. They used fire to startle and direct herds, creating controlled panics that channeled animals toward kill sites. Evidence from sites like Salidar in France shows that humans repeatedly used the same locations for these drive hunts, killing hundreds of animals over generations. The limestone escarpment at Salidar became a death trap for wild horses and reindeer, driven to the edge and either falling or leaping to their deaths, where hunters waited to finish them off. The development of projectile weapons made hunting safer and more efficient. The atlatl, a spear thrower that acts as a lever to multiply the force of a thrown spear, appeared in the Upper Paleolithic. With an atlatl, a hunter could launch a spear at much higher velocity and from greater distance than by arm alone. This reduced the need for close combat with dangerous prey. Later, the bow and arrow would further revolutionize hunting, but during much of the Ice Age, the atlatl was the state of the art. Once an animal was killed, every part was used. The meat was obviously valuable, but so was the fat, especially in winter when high-calorie food was essential for survival. The hide became clothing or shelter material. Bones and antlers were raw materials for tools and weapons. Sinews served as cordage. Nothing was wasted because waste meant starvation. This comprehensive use of animals required knowledge and skill, understanding how to process each material, how to preserve meat through drying or freezing, how to tan hides so they remained flexible even in cold weather. Storage was another innovation. During the summer and fall, when food was relatively abundant, groups would work to preserve surplus. Meat could be dried in the sun and wind, creating jerky that would last for months. In cold regions, meat could simply be frozen, buried in permafrost that acted as a natural freezer. Some sites show evidence of pits dug specifically for food storage, lined with stones to discourage scavengers. This ability to store food meant groups could survive lean periods, winter months when hunting was difficult or impossible. The social bonds within these Ice Age communities were essential for survival. No individual could master all the skills necessary to thrive in such an environment. Cooperation wasn't just beneficial, it was mandatory. The elderly, who could no longer hunt but possessed decades of accumulated knowledge, became living libraries of survival information. They knew which plants were edible and when they ripened, where water could be found during droughts, how to predict weather changes by reading clouds and animal behavior, how to navigate by stars and landmarks. Children learned by observation and participation, gradually accumulating the skills they would need as adults. Evidence from Ice Age burial sites suggests that communities cared for injured and disabled members. Skeletons show healed fractures, infections survived, conditions that would have been debilitating and prevented the individual from contributing economically. Yet these people were kept alive, fed, sheltered, integrated into the group. This implies compassion, but also recognition that every person's knowledge and experience had value beyond their immediate productive capacity. The psychological impact of Ice Age life is harder to reconstruct, but we can make educated guesses. The constant awareness of mortality, the knowledge that a hunting accident, a predator attack, an infection, a harsh winter could end your life or the lives of those you loved, must have created a psychology attuned to risk, to the fragility of existence. At the same time, the night sky would have been spectacular in ways modern city dwellers can barely imagine. With no light pollution, the Milky Way stretched overhead in brilliant detail. Meteor showers, auroras in northern latitudes, the phases of the moon marking time. The universe would have felt close, immediate, full of mystery and wonder. These experiences shaped human consciousness in ways that persist today. Our fear of the dark, our tendency to see agency in random events, our deep need for social connection, our capacity for both violence and compassion. All of these traits were forged during the hundreds of thousands of years our ancestors spent surviving in Ice Age conditions. We are descended from the survivors, from the people who were cautious enough to avoid unnecessary risks but brave enough to face necessary ones, clever enough to solve novel problems but traditional enough to preserve hard-won knowledge, individualistic enough to innovate but social enough to share innovations with their groups. Somewhere in southern France, around 32,000 years ago, a person entered a cave carrying a torch. The flickering light pushed back the darkness, revealing walls of limestone, smooth surfaces waiting to receive images. This person had come prepared, carrying pigments ground for minerals, ochre for red and yellow, manganese dioxide for black, perhaps charcoal from the fire. They had brought tools for mixing pigments with water or animal fat, for applying them to the wall. They had an idea, an image in their mind that they wanted to transfer to this permanent surface. What they created, along with others who came after them over thousands of years, what the cave art of Chalvet, Lascaux, Altamira, and dozens of other sites across Europe. These paintings are among humanity's earliest surviving artistic achievements, and they are extraordinary. The artists didn't just draw stick figures. They created sophisticated representations of animals, horses and bison, lions and rhinoceroses, rendered with attention to anatomy, proportion, movement. They used the natural contours of cave walls to create three-dimensional effects, making animals appear to emerge from the stone. They depicted scenes, narratives, showing animals running, fighting, giving birth. These weren't primitive daubs. They were masterworks created by people with observational skills, technical ability, and artistic vision that rivals anything in the history of art. And they raise profound questions. Why did people create them? The caves where these paintings are found are often deep, difficult to access, requiring crawling through narrow passages into chambers where no one lived, where daylight never penetrated. These weren't decorations for living spaces. They were something else, something special, set apart from everyday life. Many theories have been proposed. Perhaps the caves were sacred spaces, locations for rituals and ceremonies. The images might have been part of hunting magic, representations meant to ensure successful hunts by symbolically capturing the animal spirits. They might have been shamanic visions, images seen during altered states of consciousness induced by rhythmic drumming, chanting, sensory deprivation in the darkness of the cave. They might have been educational, teaching young people about the animals they would need to hunt, their appearance and behavior. They might have been astronomical calendars or territorial markers, or simply art for art's sake, beauty created for its own reward. We may never know with certainty what motivated these artists, but the paintings themselves demonstrate something crucial. By 30,000 years ago, humans had fully developed the capacity for symbolic representation, for taking ideas from the mind and expressing them in external, permanent form. They could imagine futures and remember pasts, and they felt compelled to record these mental experiences in ways that would outlast their individual lives. Cave art appears relatively late in human history, mostly within the last 40,000 years. But the cognitive capacities underlying it were much older. The use of ochre and other pigments extends back hundreds of thousands of years, as we've seen. Personal ornaments, beads made from shells, teeth, stones, appear at sites across Africa and Asia from more than 100,000 years ago. These ornaments were worn on the body, visible to others, communicating something about the wearer's identity, status, or affiliation. When you choose to wear a particular ornament, to paint your face or body in a certain pattern, you're making a statement. You're saying something about who you are, which group you belong to, how you wish to be perceived. This is fundamentally symbolic behavior. Burial practices provide another window into the developing human mind. The oldest known burials date to around 100,000 years ago. At Kafsa Cave in Israel, archaeologists found the remains of a young child buried with red deer antlers placed in their arms. At Skull Cave nearby, an adult was buried wearing a necklace of shells. These deliberate placements suggest that the living were taking care to provide the dead with objects, perhaps for use in an afterlife, or simply as expressions of love and remembrance. By 50,000 years ago, burial practices had become more elaborate. At Lake Mungo in Australia, a man was buried with red ochre spread over his body, the earliest known use of ochre in a mortuary context outside of Africa. In Europe, Neanderthals and modern humans both practiced burial, sometimes placing flowers or tools with the deceased. These practices imply beliefs about death, about what happens to consciousness when the body stops functioning. They suggest that Ice Age humans wondered about the same existential questions that still occupy us today. Music, too, has deep roots in human culture. The oldest known musical instruments are bone flutes from sites in Germany, dating to about 40,000 years ago. These flutes, carved from bird bones and mammoth ivory, had finger holes and could play multi-note melodies. Someone had to understand acoustics, had to know how to position the holes to produce specific pitches, had to practice playing the instrument to master it. The existence of these flutes implies that music was valued, that people invested time and effort in creating it, that it served important functions in social life. What functions? Music creates shared emotional experiences. When a group sings together, their voices and breathing synchronize, creating a sense of unity and cohesion. Music can mark important events, accompany rituals, tell stories, soothe infants, coordinate work. It can express emotions that words can't capture, sadness and joy, longing and triumph. The fact that every known human culture, past and present, creates music suggests that it's a human universal, something deeply embedded in our psychology. Dance likely accompanied music. Though we have no direct evidence of Ice Age dancing, it seems almost certain that people moved rhythmically to music and percussion. Dance is another universal human behavior found in every culture. Like music, it creates synchrony, bonds individuals into groups, expresses emotions, marks important transitions. At some point in human evolution, perhaps quite early, our ancestors began to dance, and in doing so, they strengthened the social bonds that allowed them to survive. Storytelling may be the oldest art form. Unlike painting, music, and dance, storytelling leaves no archaeological trace. But language developed, at least in part, to transmit information, and stories are perhaps the most effective way to package information for transmission. Through stories, knowledge about the environment, about social norms, about past events, about mythical ancestors and spirits, could be passed from generation to generation. Stories entertain, which makes them memorable. They encode wisdom in narrative form. They create shared identity, giving a group a common origin story, a sense of being connected across time. Anthropologists who study contemporary hunter-gatherer societies find that storytelling is central to social life. Around the evening fire, after the day's work is done, people tell stories. They recount the day's hunt, transforming a simple event into narrative with drama and humor. They tell stories their grandparents told them, myths about how the world came to be, why animals behave as they do, what the stars are, where people go when they die. These stories aren't just entertainment. They're the glue that holds culture together, the way that knowledge and values are transmitted, the means by which individuals understand their place in the world. It's tempting to imagine that Ice Age people told similar stories around their fires. The old hunter describing a close encounter with a cave lion, exaggerating for effect, making the listeners gasp and laugh. The grandmother explaining why certain animals must be treated with respect, why certain places are sacred, why the tribe does things the way it does. The young person trying out a new story, watching to see if it resonates, if others will remember it and pass it on. These scenes, though we have no direct evidence for them, seem likely. They fit what we know about human nature and what contemporary hunter-gatherers do. By 20,000 years ago, the cultural elaboration of human life had become rich and diverse. Different groups had developed distinctive tool styles, artistic traditions, ornamental preferences. This variability marks the full flowering of culture, the emergence of the kind of group-specific learned behavior that defines humanity. We weren't just adapting to our environments anymore. We were creating environments of meaning, worlds of symbols and stories and beliefs that existed alongside the physical world but transcended it. This was, in some sense, the final step in becoming fully human. Every human being alive today is descended from people who lived in small groups, bands of perhaps 20 to 50 individuals related by blood and marriage. For hundreds of thousands of years, this was the only form of human social organization. There were no cities, no states, no institutions beyond the family and the band. Everyone knew everyone else intimately. Your survival depended on maintaining good relationships with the people around you, and their survival depended on you. These bands weren't isolated. They interacted with neighboring bands, sometimes peacefully, sometimes not. Genetic evidence shows that humans have always engaged in some level of outbreeding, marrying outside their immediate group. This makes evolutionary sense. Inbreeding leads to genetic problems, reduced fitness, increased vulnerability to disease. By exchanging mates with other groups, bands maintain genetic diversity while also creating social ties, alliances that could be crucial during times of resource scarcity or conflict. The structure of these alliances would have been kinship-based. Anthropologists studying contemporary hunter-gatherers find that kinship terminology is often complex, distinguishing between many types of relatives and outlining specific obligations and rights for each relationship. Your maternal uncle might have different responsibilities toward you than your paternal uncle. Your cross cousins, the children of your parents' opposite-sex siblings, might be preferred marriage partners, while your parallel cousins, children of your parents' same-sex siblings, might be considered too closely related. These systems aren't arbitrary. They're solutions to the problem of organizing social life without formal institutions, creating predictable structures in which people know their roles and obligations. Leadership in Ice Age bands was probably situational rather than formal. Someone might lead a hunt because they were the best tracker, but someone else might lead a decision about where to camp because they knew the territory. Decisions were likely made through consensus, with prestige and influence earned through demonstrated ability and generosity. Forcing others to follow you would be difficult in a small group where everyone is armed and no one has vastly superior resources. Better to lead through example and persuasion, to build networks of reciprocal obligation that make people willing to follow you voluntarily. Reciprocity was the foundation of social life. If I share meat with you today, I trust that you'll share with me tomorrow when you're successful and I'm not. Over time, these exchanges create webs of obligation and trust that bind groups together. But reciprocity only works if people remember who has shared and who hasn't, who can be trusted and who might cheat. This requires cognitive abilities that we sometimes take for granted but that are actually sophisticated. The ability to track multiple social relationships over time, to remember favors and debts, to calculate fairness, to feel gratitude and resentment. Some anthropologists argue that this need to track social relationships was one of the main drivers of human brain evolution. Living in larger groups requires more social intelligence. You need to remember more relationships, predict more behaviors, navigate more complex alliance structures. There's a correlation across primate species between group size and relative brain size, suggesting that social complexity drives cognitive evolution. Humans, with their uniquely large brains and complex societies, sit at the extreme end of this relationship. But cooperation within groups didn't eliminate conflict between groups. Territory, resources, mates, all of these were potential sources of dispute. When bands encountered each other, the interaction could go many ways. They might trade, exchange information, arrange marriages. They might simply avoid each other, maintaining distance. Or they might fight, especially if resources were scarce and one group thought they could successfully drive the other away from valuable hunting grounds or water sources. Evidence of intergroup violence appears in the archaeological record. Skeletal remains from the Upper Paleolithic occasionally show traumatic injuries consistent with warfare. Healed wounds from projectile weapons, skull fractures from club blows, cut marks suggesting scalping or mutilation. A site at Jebel Sahaba in Sudan, dating to around 13,000 years ago, contained a cemetery where many individuals showed signs of violent death, bodies with stone projectile points embedded in bones. This might represent a massacre, one group wiping out another. But violence wasn't constant or universal. Many Ice Age skeletons show no signs of trauma. Many groups probably lived their entire lives without experiencing serious intergroup conflict. The level of violence depended on local conditions, population density, resource availability, cultural norms. And sometimes in places, groups cooperated and coexisted peacefully. In others, competition for scarce resources led to raids, feuds, and warfare. Within groups, mechanisms existed to control conflict. Sharing norms reduced inequality, making it harder for individuals to accumulate resources and use them to dominate others. Mockery and ostracism could be deployed against people who tried to aggrandize themselves or who consistently violated group norms. In extreme cases, a person who became dangerous to the group could be exiled or even killed, though this would have been a last resort, given the value of every individual to a small band's survival. The evolution of human morality probably occurred in this context. We have strong intuitions about fairness, about right and wrong, about what constitutes appropriate behavior. These intuitions aren't culturally arbitrary, at least not entirely. Across cultures, certain moral principles recur. Reciprocity, loyalty to one's group, respect for authority, care for the vulnerable. These principles make sense given our evolutionary history. They're the rules that allowed small groups of related individuals to cooperate effectively, to survive in challenging environments, to pass their genes to the next generation. At the same time, human morality has always had limits. The intense cooperation within groups often coexisted with indifference or hostility toward outsiders. People who aren't part of your group, who don't share your language or customs, who compete with you for resources, these people might not be granted the same moral consideration as group members. This double standard, cooperation within and aggression without, has been a feature of human societies throughout history. It's not pretty, but it's part of our inheritance from our Ice Age ancestors. Understanding this doesn't justify contemporary conflicts or prejudices. Our biology creates tendencies, not destinies. Humans have tremendous capacity for empathy, for expanding the circle of moral concern to include people very different from ourselves. Modern ethics calls us to transcend our parochial instincts, to recognize the common humanity in all people. But doing so requires effort because we're working against cognitive defaults that evolved in a very different world, a world of small groups surrounded by strangers who might be threats. The climate during the Pleistocene was not stable. It fluctuated wildly on timescales from decades to tens of thousands of years. Ice cores from Antarctica and Greenland, containing trapped bubbles of ancient atmosphere, allow scientists to reconstruct past temperatures and atmospheric composition with remarkable precision. What these ice cores reveal is a climate system that oscillated between extreme states, driven by complex interactions between Earth's orbit, ocean currents, atmospheric composition, and ice sheet dynamics. Every 100,000 years or so, the planet would slide into a glacial maximum, when ice sheets covered much of the northern hemisphere and global temperatures were 10 to 15 degrees Celsius colder than today. These periods lasted tens of thousands of years. Then, relatively abruptly over the course of a few thousand years, the climate would warm, entering an interglacial period like the one we're in now. But even within these major cycles, smaller fluctuations occurred. Temperatures could swing dramatically over centuries or even decades, creating periods of rapid climate change that would have severely stressed ecosystems and the human populations dependent on them. One of the most dramatic examples is the Younger Dryas, a period of intense cold that began around 12,800 years ago and lasted for about 1,200 years. The climate had been warming after the last glacial maximum, ice sheets were retreating, and then suddenly temperatures plummeted back to near glacial conditions. In Europe and North America, glaciers re-advanced. The warm, wet conditions that had been supporting forests gave way to cold, dry steppes. Many large animal species, already stressed by hunting pressure and changing habitats, went extinct. What caused the Younger Dryas? The leading theory involves changes in ocean circulation. As the massive ice sheets covering North America melted, they released huge volumes of fresh water into the North Atlantic. This fresh water, being less dense than salt water, disrupted the thermohaline circulation, the global conveyor belt of ocean currents that redistributes heat around the planet. When this circulation shut down or weakened, heat stopped flowing from the tropics to the northern latitudes, and the climate rapidly cooled. For humans living through the Younger Dryas, the change would have been dramatic and frightening. Within a single lifetime, the world transformed. Animals they had hunted for generations disappeared or migrated away. Plants they had relied on for food became scarce. Water sources that had been reliable dried up. Groups that had been sedentary, settling in one place for at least part of the year, were forced to become mobile again, following resources, adapting to new conditions. But they survived. Humans proved remarkably flexible in the face of climate chaos. When resources in one area declined, people moved. When traditional prey animals disappeared, they switched to new species or intensified their reliance on plant foods. When the old toolkits weren't adequate for new tasks, they innovated, creating new implements, new techniques. This behavioral flexibility, more than any particular physical or technological adaptation, was the key to human success. Evidence from archaeological sites shows this adaptability in action. In the Near East, during the warm period before the Younger Dryas, groups began to settle in villages, building permanent structures, relying more heavily on cultivated plants. These were the Natufians, hunter-gatherers who were beginning to experiment with agriculture. When the Younger Dryas hit and the climate cooled, many of these villages were abandoned. People returned to more mobile lifestyles, following game, exploiting a wider range of wild resources. But the knowledge gained during the experimental period wasn't lost. When the climate warmed again after the Younger Dryas, agriculture resumed and eventually became the dominant mode of subsistence. This pattern of innovation during favorable periods and retrenchment during harsh periods, followed by renewed innovation when conditions improved, probably recurred many times throughout human prehistory. Progress wasn't linear. It was punctuated with advances followed by setbacks, but with a general trend toward increasing cultural complexity, more sophisticated technology, larger populations. The ability to adapt behaviorally without waiting for biological evolution to catch up gave humans an enormous advantage. When the climate shifted, when new diseases emerged, when competitors appeared, humans could respond within generations rather than waiting millennia for natural selection to produce genetic solutions. This is the power of culture. It allows for rapid, non-genetic adaptation. A new tool design, a new hunting technique, a new social arrangement, these could spread through a population in years or decades, propagating horizontally through learning rather than vertically through reproduction. But behavioral flexibility alone wasn't sufficient. Humans also benefited from biological traits that supported adaptability. Our omnivorous diet meant we could switch between resources depending on availability. Our lack of specialization, our generalist physiology, meant we could survive in a wide range of environments. Our large brains, expensive to maintain but capable of solving novel problems, allowed us to figure out how to exploit new resources and environments. Our prolonged childhood, during which we learn rather than reproduce, created space for the transmission of complex cultural knowledge. All of these traits working together made humans the most adaptable species on the planet, capable of surviving and thriving in conditions that would challenge or eliminate more specialized organisms. When the ice sheets advanced and forests became tundra, humans adapted. When the ice sheets retreated and sea levels rose, drowning coastal settlements, humans adapted. When volcanic eruptions darkened the sky and caused famines, humans adapted. Not always easily, not without suffering and loss, but consistently enough that the species as a whole survived and expanded. Around 15,000 years ago, as the last ice age was ending, human societies around the world were becoming more complex. In some regions, particularly in the Middle East, but also in parts of Asia and the Americas, people were settling down, building permanent or semi-permanent villages, developing more intensive relationships with certain plant and animal species. These societies were still hunter-gatherers in the sense that they didn't practice full-scale agriculture, but they were pushing the boundaries of what hunting and gathering could support. In the Near East, the Natufian culture provides a window into this transitional period. Natufian sites, dating from around 14,500 to 11,600 years ago, contain stone foundations of circular houses, storage pits, grinding stones for processing grain, and cemeteries with elaborate burials. These people were harvesting wild cereals, wheat and barley that grew abundantly in the region, processing the grain with stone sickles and grinding tools, storing surplus for use during lean seasons. They were still hunting gazelle and other animals, but plants were becoming increasingly important in their diet. Why settle down? Traditional hunter-gatherers are mobile because they have to be. They follow game, move to where plants are ripening, avoid depleting any one area's resources. But in certain environments, especially those with reliable, concentrated resources, mobility becomes less necessary. If you're living near a river full of salmon that run predictably every year, or in an area where groves of nut-producing trees provide abundant food, staying in one place might be more efficient than moving around. You can invest in infrastructure, build better shelters, create storage facilities, accumulate possessions that would be burdensome to carry if you were constantly moving. Sedentism, settling in one place, creates new possibilities but also new challenges. When you're mobile, waste management isn't an issue. You simply move away from accumulated garbage and human waste. When you're settled, you need to deal with these things or risk disease. Population density can increase in settled communities, which brings benefits like more hands for labor and defense, but also costs like increased disease transmission and resource depletion in the surrounding area. The Natufians managed these challenges successfully for thousands of years. But they also faced the Younger Dryas, that period of rapid cooling that disrupted ecosystems across the northern hemisphere. Some Natufian sites were abandoned during this period, suggesting that the climate shift made sedentism less viable. But other sites persisted, and by the end of the Younger Dryas, around 11,600 years ago, something new was emerging: deliberate cultivation of plants, the beginning of agriculture. The transition to agriculture wasn't sudden or uniform. It happened independently in multiple regions around the world at roughly the same time, give or take a few thousand years. In the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, people began cultivating wheat, barley, lentils, and peas. In China, they cultivated millet and rice. In Mesoamerica, they cultivated maize, beans, and squash. In the Andes, they cultivated potatoes and quinoa. In New Guinea, they cultivated taro and yams. In West Africa, they cultivated sorghum and millet. Why did agriculture emerge when it did in so many places? The timing correlates with the end of the Ice Age and the beginning of the Holocene, the current interglacial period. The warming climate created conditions favorable for plant cultivation. Longer growing seasons, more reliable rainfall in many regions, higher atmospheric carbon dioxide levels that promoted plant growth. But climate alone doesn't explain the shift. Humans had lived through previous interglacial periods without adopting agriculture. Population growth may have been a key factor. By the end of the Pleistocene, humans had colonized almost every habitable environment on Earth. In many regions, population densities were reaching levels where traditional hunting and gathering couldn't support everyone comfortably. When a hunter-gatherer band grows too large, the usual solution is fission. The band splits, with some members going off to form a new group in a new territory. But by 15,000 years ago, there were fewer and fewer empty territories to move into. People had to find ways to support larger populations in the same amount of space. and agriculture, which can produce far more calories per acre than hunting and gathering, was the solution. Another factor may have been the extinction of the megafauna. During the late Pleistocene and early Holocene, large animals disappeared from every continent humans inhabited. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, woolly rhinoceroses, giant wombats, enormous flightless birds, dozens of species went extinct within a relatively short period. The causes are debated: climate change, human hunting, or some combination of the two. But the result was clear. A major source of food and materials disappeared, forcing humans to rely more heavily on smaller animals and plants. Whatever the causes, agriculture transformed human existence. Farming supports much higher population densities than hunting and gathering, but it also ties people to specific plots of land. You can't farm if you're constantly moving. This means you must defend your land from others, invest in improving it, worry about inheritance and property rights. Agriculture creates surplus, food beyond immediate needs, which allows for specialization. Not everyone needs to produce food, freeing some people to become artisans, traders, warriors, priests, rulers. This specialization leads to social stratification, the emergence of hierarchies, inequality in ways that don't exist or are much less pronounced in hunter-gatherer societies. These changes didn't happen overnight. The transition from hunting and gathering to full-scale agriculture took thousands of years in most regions. People didn't wake up one morning and decide to become farmers. They gradually intensified their interactions with certain plants, selecting seeds from the most productive individuals, clearing land to encourage their growth, eventually reaching a point where they depended on these plants and the plants depended on them. This coevolution between humans and domesticated species is one of the most profound developments in the history of life on Earth, right up there with the evolution of photosynthesis or multicellularity. But our Ice Age ancestors, the people living in the hundreds of thousands of years before agriculture, didn't know any of this was coming. They lived fully in their present, solving the immediate problems of survival, passing on their knowledge to their children, creating the cultural foundations that would eventually support civilization. They are the deep roots of our family tree, the people whose struggles and innovations made everything that followed possible. Your body is a Paleolithic body. Your brain is a Paleolithic brain. Evolution doesn't work on timescales of 10,000 years, not for complex traits like human physiology and cognition. The agricultural revolution, the rise of cities, the industrial revolution, the digital age, all of these are too recent to have significantly altered human biology. You are, in almost every meaningful way, the same as the people who painted caves and hunted mammoths and sat around fires telling stories under stars unpolluted by city lights. This mismatch between our evolved biology and our modern environment creates many of the challenges we face. Our taste for sugar, fat, and salt made perfect sense in the Paleolithic, when these nutrients were scarce and valuable. Getting as much as possible when you found them was adaptive. But in a world where these nutrients are abundant and cheap, our evolved preferences contribute to epidemic levels of obesity, diabetes, and heart disease. We're not adapted to the modern diet. We're adapted to scarcity, and abundance confuses our systems. The same applies to our psychology. Humans evolved to live in small groups of people we knew personally. We're adapted to environments where threats are immediate and physical. Predators, injuries, hunger, exposure. Our stress response, the fight or flight system, works well for those kinds of challenges. But it doesn't work well for chronic, abstract stressors like job insecurity, financial debt, or existential worries about the future. Our nervous systems can't distinguish between a charging mammoth and an angry email from your boss. They respond to both with elevated heart rate, cortisol release, heightened alertness. When stress is chronic, this response becomes maladaptive, contributing to anxiety, depression, and various physical ailments. Our social instincts are also Paleolithic. We're adapted to maintain relationships with about 150 people, a number known as Dunbar's number, after the anthropologist who calculated it based on primate brain sizes and social group sizes. This is roughly the number of people you can know personally, whose relationships and histories you can track, with whom you can maintain meaningful connections. But modern life often demands that we interact with thousands or millions of people, whether in person in large cities or virtually through social media. These interactions are shallow by necessity. We simply don't have the cognitive capacity to maintain deep relationships with that many people. The result is often a sense of isolation despite being constantly surrounded by or connected to others. Even our circadian rhythms are Paleolithic. Humans evolved to be awake during daylight and asleep during darkness, synchronized with the sun's cycle. But modern life, with its artificial lighting and shift work and global connectivity requiring communication across time zones, often disrupts this natural rhythm. The consequences include sleep disorders, fatigue, reduced cognitive performance, and increased risk of various health problems. Understanding our Paleolithic heritage doesn't mean we should try to return to that lifestyle. The notion of the Paleolithic diet or ancestral health movement, while containing some insights, often romanticizes the past and oversimplifies both Paleolithic life and modern nutritional science. Life in the Paleolithic was hard. Infant mortality was high. Many people didn't survive to adulthood. Those who did often had injuries, infections, parasites. Lifespans were short by modern standards, probably averaging 30 to 40 years, though those who survived childhood could live longer. We don't want to return to that, but we can learn from understanding how our bodies and minds were shaped by that environment and try to create modern lives that better accommodate our evolved needs. This might mean prioritizing face-to-face social interactions over digital ones, spending time in nature, engaging in physical activity that mimics the varied movements of hunting and gathering rather than repetitive exercises in a gym, eating whole foods rather than highly processed ones, protecting sleep by limiting artificial light exposure in the evening, finding ways to experience the kinds of challenges and achievements that made our ancestors feel competent and valued. On a deeper level, understanding our Paleolithic heritage can foster humility and perspective. We are not the pinnacle of creation, the inevitable endpoint of evolution. We are one species among millions, adapted to specific conditions, carrying within us the legacy of billions of years of evolution and hundreds of thousands of years of human cultural development. The struggles of our ancestors, their ingenuity in the face of unimaginable challenges, their capacity for cooperation and creativity and love, these are our inheritance. We carry their genes, but also their achievements, the accumulated knowledge and culture that they built and passed down through countless generations. Every language you speak, every tool you use, every story you know, every piece of music that moves you, all of this rests on foundations laid in the Paleolithic. Writing is only 5,000 years old. Before that, all human knowledge was transmitted orally, through stories and songs and direct demonstration. The fact that complex societies emerged at all, that agriculture was invented independently in multiple places, that people built monuments in cities and civilizations, all of this was possible because Paleolithic humans had developed language, symbolic thought, the capacity for cooperation and innovation at scales large enough to support these developments. In a very real sense, we're still living in the wake of the Paleolithic, still working out the implications of capacities that evolved during that era. Our ability to modify our environment, which has now reached scales that affect the entire planet's climate and ecosystems, began with the control of fire and the manufacture of stone tools. Our capacity for large-scale cooperation and conflict, which manifest in everything from global trade networks to world wars, began with the alliance structures and territorial disputes of Paleolithic bands. Our drive to create meaning, to tell stories, to make art, to wonder about our place in the universe, all of this emerged during those hundreds of thousands of years when our ancestors were becoming fully human. They didn't know they were creating the future. They were simply living, trying to survive and thrive in the present, passing on what they knew to their children. But their legacy is everything we are and everything we've built. We exist because they succeeded. Every person alive today can trace their lineage back through an unbroken chain of ancestors, each of whom survived long enough to reproduce, all the way back to those early Homo sapiens in Africa 300,000 years ago, and beyond them to earlier hominins, to the first mammals, to the first vertebrates, to the first multicellular organisms, to the first cells, to the chemical reactions in ancient oceans that started the whole process of life on Earth. That's your story. That's all of our story. We are the product of deep time, of evolution's patient work, of our ancestors' struggles and triumphs. Understanding this doesn't make modern life's challenges disappear, but it can provide context, a sense of connection to something larger than yourself, an appreciation for the remarkable journey that brought you here. Your breathing has slowed. Your body has released its tension. You're floating now in that space between waking and sleeping, between today's world and the ancient world you've been visiting in your mind. The people you've been hearing about, the Paleolithic humans who survived ice ages and megafauna, who painted caves and napped stones and told stories around fires, they're not strangers. They're your family, your ancestors, separated from you by time but connected to you by an unbroken line of descent. Their blood is your blood. Their DNA spirals through your cells. Their struggles made your existence possible. Think about that for a moment as you drift. Every challenge they faced, they overcame. Every crisis that threatened to extinguish the human line, they survived. Starvation and disease and predators and climate catastrophes and volcanic winters and ice sheets and all the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to, they endured all of it. And they didn't just endure. They created. They innovated. They painted and sang and told stories and loved their children and wondered about the stars and tried to make sense of their existence. They were fully human, with minds as complex as yours, hearts as capable of joy and sorrow, imaginations as rich with possibility. You carry their legacy in ways both literal and metaphorical. The shape of your skeleton, optimized for upright walking and long-distance running. The structure of your teeth, adapted for an omnivorous diet. The three-color vision that helps you spot ripe fruit. The sweat glands that allow you to cool through evaporation, enabling sustained physical activity even in hot climates. The fine motor control of your hands, capable of manipulating objects with extraordinary precision. The enlarged brain, particularly the prefrontal cortex, that allows for planning, abstract thought, language. All of these traits were shaped during your species' long evolution, most of it spent as hunter-gatherers in the Paleolithic. But you also carry their cultural legacy. The stories you tell yourself about who you are and what matters, these descend from stories told around Paleolithic fires. The moral intuitions you have about fairness and loyalty and reciprocity, these evolved in the context of small group living. The aesthetic sense that makes you respond emotionally to certain landscapes, to flowing water and green vegetation and prospects that allow you to see far into the distance. This sense was shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of living in savannas and grasslands where being able to spot opportunities and threats at a distance meant the difference between eating and being eaten. Even your capacity to be lying here now, listening to someone tell you about the deep past, relaxing into sleep, this capacity has ancient roots. Sleep itself is ancient, found in insects and fish and amphibians and reptiles and birds and mammals. But the specifically human pattern of sleep, consolidated into a single long period each night rather than spread across day and night, may have evolved as a response to predation risk and the benefits of social bonding around fires during evening hours. When you sleep, you're engaging in an activity shaped by millions of years of evolution, fine-tuned by natural selection to restore body and mind, to consolidate memories, to regulate emotions, to prepare you for the next day's challenges. The dreams you have while sleeping may also connect you to the past. Dreaming is mysterious, its function still debated by scientists. But one theory suggests that dreams help process emotional experiences, integrate new information with existing knowledge, simulate threats so you can practice responding to them. If this is true, then your dreams serve the same function they served for your Paleolithic ancestors, helping you navigate a complex, challenging world, preparing you for dangers you might face, allowing you to mentally rehearse solutions to problems. The content of your dreams is modern, but the mechanism is ancient. You can do the same. You don't have to solve everything tonight. You don't have to figure out your life or save the world or be productive or accomplish anything. You can simply be, simply exist, simply allow yourself the grace of rest. Your ancestors survived ice ages. You can survive whatever you're facing. Your ancestors created art and language and culture from nothing. You carry that creative capacity within you. Your ancestors loved and grieved and hoped and feared, felt all the emotions you feel, and they kept going. You can keep going. Tomorrow will come regardless. The sun will rise as it has for 4.5 billion years, as it will for billions more. The earth will keep turning. Life will continue its patient work of adapting, surviving, propagating. And you will wake refreshed, ready to engage with whatever the day brings, carrying within you the strength and resilience of countless generations. But all of that is for tomorrow. Tonight there is only this moment, this breath, this heartbeat, this gentle slide into unconsciousness. Let go of the stories and the facts and the images of the past. Let go of your thoughts about the future. Be here now, in your body, in this bed, in this safe space where you can release your vigilance and trust that you will be okay. The cave painters are with you. The tool makers are with you. The hunters and gatherers, the storytellers and dancers, the mothers and fathers who loved their children across 300,000 years of human existence. They are all with you, their legacy living in you, their hopes fulfilled by your existence. You are the answer to their question of whether their struggles mattered. You are proof that they did. Sleep well, child of the Paleolithic. Dream deep. Wake strong. The future belongs to you as the past belongs to your ancestors, as the present belongs to all of us together. Rest now. Let the weight of 300,000 years of human history cradle you gently into sleep. Let the knowledge that you are part of something vast and ancient comfort you. Let the awareness that you carry within you the resilience of your ancestors give you peace. The fire at the mouth of the cave burns low. The stars will overhead. The night deepens. And you sleep as your ancestors slept, as your descendants will sleep, part of the endless cycle of rest and waking, death and renewal, the great rhythm of life that began billions of years ago and will continue long after you're gone. But for now, for this moment, you are here. You exist. You matter. And that is enough. If you've enjoyed tonight's journey into the deep past, if this story has given you peace or perspective or simply helped you relax into sleep, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us continue creating these explorations into history's mysteries, these expeditions into the forgotten times when the foundations of everything we are were laid down, one generation at a time, one innovation at a time, one story at a time. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being part of this ongoing human story. Sleep well.